All right, here we have the host. Now, in TTRPG terms, this is an episode that is there solely to introduce new things to the setting. Like here is a new alien race who are allies, and they're going to help us with, the problem of the week. Oh, wait, there's a problem, and we need to help them help us. Blah blah blah. What happens? Now, the main issue is, of course, that the alpha and beta moons of Peliar Zell are having some sort of conflict, and arbitration is required, and that a Trill diplomat is here to handle the arbitration. People who have watched Star Trek Deep Space Nine have seen the characters of Jadzia Dax and her successor, Esri Dax, quite a lot. Outside Deep Space Nine, Trill have actually been seen very, very rarely. Most of what we have established about the Trill comes from the fact that in Deep Space Nine, Dax was a main cast member through the entire series, from the first episode to the last, I think. Maybe a few episodes that they didn't have Dax in. Switching from Jadzia Dax to Esri Dax was because they wanted to recast Dax. And yeah, and they'd already established that Trill's symbionts and that Jadzia had one could be, uh, just passed off like that. So they killed off Jadzia in a way that the symbiont could be passed off to Esri, which happened and stuff. Anyway, though, this episode, though, suffers from the fact that it's a prototype version of the Trill, and that in Deep Space Nine, they didn't actually use the Trill as they are seen in this episode. They used the idea of the Trill, but don't stick to the details that are established in here, which is a bit interesting, honestly. Oh, also, this episode actually delves into something that's actually very important too. And that is the idea that Trill symbionts can be put into non-Trill. That's something that's a bit awkward, but because it nearly kills Riker. It's not something that works well in races other than the Trill, because of the fact that the Trill and the symbionts are from the same planet and kind of sort of evolved to live together and so on and so forth. Trill biochemistry just naturally works better with them. And also, when they're doing the surgery to implant the symbiont in this episode, but maybe possibly leave it out of later stuff or reword it in later stuff, they kind of say that part of the reason that the symbionts are able to bond with Trill the way they do is that there are aspects of Trill internal organs that are kind of sort of like joining points where the symbiont can join to. Now, one thing that's interesting is that while Trill have a long history of being active on the galactic scale, I mean, in TOS era, they had Trill that had been talking to the Federation and the Klingon Empire. I mean, like that infamous scene from Star Trek Discovery where they just have a bunch of Trill walking around on Clonus was actually something that was established prior to Star Trek Discovery that the Trill had actually done that in the past. Granted, this is one of those many things that Jadzia Dax had talked about, and this was actually part of the explanation for why it was that Jadzia Dax, or rather the Dax symbiont, was familiar with certain Klingon generals who were old war veterans. And it's like, wait a second, how did you meet those guys? Yeah, then they say that, oh yeah, the Trill and the Klingons are totally cool with each other. Okay, again though, that is a way of establishing that a certain race is not necessarily powerful on the galactic scale, but well traveled. There's actually a recurring theme with the Trill is that their race, due to the way that the symbionts work, if their homeworld was destroyed, they would be screwed because symbionts cannot reproduce while inside a host. They need to be in the whole like pool thingy in order to reproduce, which doesn't get established in TNG. Comes up later in DS9. And here's the other thing. One of the things that TNG established about them is that prior to this incident, it was generally unknown to the Federation, at least, probably to the Klingons as well, but we never find out that the Trill were actually two different species, and that the symbiont wasn't actually an invasive parasite. It was a, you know, normal part of the way that Trill did things. Mm. Anyway, though, see, as part of the plot, though, Odan gets injured by a ship that is, well, hmm, just some random ship. Which ship? I don't know. Doesn't even tell us. See, the two Peliar Zell moons are really, really unhappy with this, and that some of the people actually like genuinely don't want a mediation at all, which is part of the reason why it's so important to have the Enterprise D here as part of the mediation. And to be honest, the mediation is, as presented in the episode, a backdrop for having plot happen. It's not something that you would actually have the players dealing with, unless you want to. You could absolutely totally do that. Again, because of the fact that Riker acts as a temporary host for the Odan symbiont, the that could be seen as one of the players acting as a temporary host, and thus the player taking on the role of the ambassador. Although, one thing to point out here is that the way the whole symbiont thing works is that the symbiont will often be over 100 years old. Like in the case of the Dax symbiont, they basically say that Dax uh, had actually been to Cronus in TOS era, I think, something like that. In that it's just something that it's very hush hush, but part of what made the Trill so successful in terms of scientific advancement is that individuals who were experts at scientific fields could pass that expertise on to their later hosts, and that these hosts would just suddenly have a whole bunch of knowledge they didn't have before as soon as they were joined. And this is part of what makes the symbionts so highly revered in Trill civilization. Now, this is also what makes Odan the guy who they chose to be the negotiator for this incident. All of the stuff that he knows about the Peliar Zell situation is things that would take you years to really, really appreciate properly. And of course, avoiding having the two Peliar Zell planets go to war is the entire point of the diplomatic negotiations and the entire reason why the uh, Enterprise is in the solar system at all. So, it's the reason for plot to happen. And that just leaves all of the drama about the fact that you need to have a temporary host for the symbiont. Um, Notably, the Odan symbiont appears to be somewhat larger than Dax. The exact reason for this, it could just be that one of them's older than the other. We genuinely don't know. Okay, so here, this actually says that the symbionts could actually be over 500 years old. So, yeah. And what I was saying earlier about how the symbionts reproducing is that here is the cave that they live in. This says that a Trill symbiont needs to be a century old before being implanted into a host for the first time. Hmm. That's actually one of those things that's interesting to toy with is the idea of having a joined symbiont that's actually a new joined symbiont and not one that has like centuries of memories. Anyway, though, but as the special alien of the week, the episode here focuses almost entirely on the Trill. It establishes a whole lot of things about the Trill, and one of the most significant things that gets ignored later on is what Trill look like. Yeah, that. And of course, one of the aspects of this is the whole like not going in a transporter because of the fact that the Trill had been keeping it secret that the symbionts existed. That was the reason for not using the transporters, is that the transporter biofilter would automatically recognize the symbiont as a separate entity from the host and thus not transport them properly. This would seemingly indicate that most, if not all races, they avoided that. But with some alien races, it is entirely possible that their transporters are not set up with biofilters the way the Federation has them set up, like Klingons. Would Klingons program an elaborate biofilter thing? Not necessarily. Anyway, though, dum dum dum. Yeah. Also, this art or facial prosthetic here used for this guy is kind of interesting because of the fact that I don't think they ever use this makeup again. Ever. As we all know, Terry Farrell had spots painted onto her skin as part of the Dax character. And in most episodes, the only place you see them is on her face and neck because that's the only part of her body that's visible that would be applicable. Now, that's another thing here is that this episode does actually establish the whole thing of Trill using the host name as the substitute for a family name. Now, that's something that's interestingly tinkered with because the fact that they never actually say what the personal name of Odan's first host is. Well, okay, this is actually at least his second host. It's not the first. And that makes things very, very strange. But Odan had, prior to this incident, been maintaining the fiction that his hosts were actually relatives of each other and that had shared information because they were, close or something. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We actually do meet some of the actual aliens of the week, the Pelians. There's two different groups of them, but that's actually just a difference of political organization and not actually being two different species. Which honestly makes a heck of a lot of sense in this situation, given that they are different moons of the same planet, more or less. Mm, and, they needed to have better communication in order to properly uh, understand each other's positions on various political matters. And that actually happened. And therefore, the problem was resolved. And oh, wait, these guys were never heard from again. That is actually an interesting thing with this one is that while the Trill got reused later on because they decided to have Jadzia Dax be a Trill as a main cast member, these guys we never see again. This is something that could have been done later on, but wasn't. And that's actually something that you should keep in mind when introducing new stuff like this. Am I going to use this later? If so, what? However, you don't need to feel compelled to use everything you have introduced later. You can always save it for later. And that is actually one of the things that's really nice about Star Trek as a setting is you don't need to reuse everything. You can always just reuse only the things you feel like it and leave the other ones for later, maybe. Anyway, though, but yeah, that's the thing about this one's interesting is that ultimately it's a diplomatic negotiation episode, but it's a diplomatic negotiation episode where the diplomatic negotiation exists for the purpose of introducing new races and ideas to the setting. The idea of a sentient species that is functionally a parasitic organism is actually very interesting and something that, uh, well, Star Trek isn't unique in doing that. It really isn't. But the Trill were an interesting race concept. Alrighty then. I think that's enough about this one. See you guys later.